Welcome, everyone. I am here today with Davidson. Today, we're going to talk about investing in Africa. Davidson, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. No, thanks, Jeremy, and I'm glad to be here. I want to just touch a little bit about investing in Africa and why investors do not need to be afraid of the African continent, all right? So, it's no secret, right, that many investors, when they think of Africa, there are certain concerns that they have which are legitimate concerns. So, some speak around political instability, currency fluctuations, regulatory uncertainty. And I'll tell you that, Jeremy, these are valid concerns because some regions on the continent they do face political volatility. Fluctuating currencies can erode returns if you don't manage it well. Think of the fact that Africa has 54 countries. So most times you're dealing with local regulations that may feel complex, especially when you compare it to established markets in the US or in Europe, right? So it's normal to have concerns about infrastructure, governance, and market transparency. But what I tell people is this: Africa is not unique in itself because you see similar risks existing in other emerging markets like South Asia and Latin America. But I come across folks who know little or nothing about those areas, but they're still saying, yeah, this is attractive for investments, but they fail to balance how Africa compares, just in terms of the opportunities that exist there versus those other regions that they feel are more compelling. And I pen it down to a lack of understanding how to manage and mitigate those risks because they do have risks, right? And each continent has its own peculiarity around it. First thing I will say is this: Africa is not a monolith, right? So, like I had said earlier on, you have 54 countries, their own political, economic, and regulatory environment. You could have two countries that straddle each other, right? But completely different in terms of culture, in terms of how they approach their politics and their economy as well. So now, another thing that I would also say is that even within there, you see countries like South Africa, Kenya, Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, like Egypt, Tunisia. There are so many of them. One thing that you can do definitely is you can mitigate your risks, first of all, by focusing on countries that have stable governments, investor friendly policies, strong growth potentials. Basically, have a portfolio diversification across different countries. For investors who we look for at Nubia Capital, when we're raising capital, we'll tell them, look, trust us enough to have a clear understanding of the different markets and how they operate, how diversification can help to reduce exposure and risk while you're still tapping into the continent's growth, basically.
I love it. What are there some regions you would highlight as more favorable across the dimensions you were talking about?
Absolutely. So, good thing there about Africa is you could categorize it into, some folks do it into four regions, but some others put it into five regions. So you have West Africa, you have South Africa, you have East Africa, you have North Africa, and then you have Central Africa. So in those regions, some countries and some economies are really stronger than the rest. We have what we call the Big Four, which are on the four regions, the four major regions: that Nigeria in the west, South Africa in the south, Egypt in the north, Kenya in the east. And when you look at how investments, particularly venture capital, has gone into Africa this last 3 to 5 years, when the startups have really taken off and we've seen more unicorns across the continent. They've pretty much we've pretty much seen successes from those countries within those four regions. So in Nigeria, you probably have about 7 unicorns that have emerged within that region. You're seeing Kenya. I mean, they have some really powerful startups. They're doing a lot in the renewable energy space. So you're seeing a lot of the electric vehicles coming out of that space, and all. They have one of the most innovative fintechs to have emerged globally. Really, in M-Pesa, that was one of the first movers. That went really far in terms of being able to utilize mobile money to make it easy, to transfer or to receive money. You have Jumia that came out of Nigeria, which is arguably what you may call the Amazon of Africa. It's a unicorn. It's listed in the New York Stock Exchange since 2019. It's kind of revolutionized online shopping across the continent. You know, wide access and range of goods and services. You have Andela as well, also a unicorn, also out of Nigeria. It's a global tech company that connects South African software developers with global companies. So you have South Africa, where there are so many amazing businesses and startups emerging from there. You have Egypt, where there's a unicorn as well in Fowry. So across these different regions, you then have what you may call secondary markets. So in West Africa, you have Ghana, you have Senegal. In East Africa, other than Kenya, you then have Uganda, Rwanda. In North Africa, you have the likes of Tunisia, Morocco. So you see a lot of these markets that feed off each other, and there are a lot of success stories going on within the continent. One thing that people need to understand is just the sheer amount of human and material capital that exists in Africa. And I tell people, look, it's a continent of 1.5 billion people. In the next 5 years, you're going to be pushing towards 2.5 billion people, but over 60% of that population is under the age of 20. So the youth dividend that Africa has presents a massive market for digital and tech solutions. You also look at how digital penetration is, keeps expanding within there. You have over 800 million people who are mobile subscribers across the continent, right? So it's like a fertile ground for fintech, e-commerce, digital services, and digital assets as well. But beautiful thing there is that some of the talents that exist there are still quite untapped. So people look to places like China, for example, for labor or for services, forgetting that in Africa, you have this youthful population. When you're talking about from energy to agriculture to healthcare to logistics, the opportunities are just huge for high returns at a much lesser rate than you would find in any other continent in the world.
I love it. Would you say it's great for an investor to invest in those countries that you've mentioned, and they would have the political stability and currency stability that you want? Obviously, they have the exits and the unicorns. Is that sufficient to just say, hey, go invest in those ones that you mentioned and that are already mentioned in the video? And or is there any extra considerations that you would add?
Okay, well, yeah, so I mean, this is where we plug some of the work that we do, right? One thing I will say is this: when you invest in venture capital or private equity funds, you have a kind of safety, because those fund managers would be expected, of course, to do their due diligence and ensure that they go into the markets where they are sure of what they do, which is what we do. We basically work across Africa, working with partners. One thing that I will say is this: we're seeing a lot of regulatory and policy advancements taking place. One of the things that I'm very proud of, and I say sometimes, is how I worked with the Nigerian government to draft the Nigeria Startup Act, which is supposed to be like an enabling legislation that would allow there to be a level of transparency for how businesses and startups can, come into the country, how investors can bring in their investments and take it out, the incentives that exist there, and all the other things that would make that ecosystem very viable. Across Africa, you're increasingly seeing countries release legislation similar to the Nigeria Startup Act. Of course, Nigeria was the third country to have a Startup Act. You already had Senegal and Tunisia that had their Startup Acts already. But now you have Kenya that is basically at the last stage of putting out the Startup Act. You have probably close to 10 countries that are doing that. Startup Acts are not the solutions to all the problems, but they show the seriousness that governments are taking to build their ecosystems, right? So being able to just work with the right partners, goes the long way. Now, we also have the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is similar to what you have with NAFTA, as well as, the European Union and some of the trade bilateral and multilateral agreements that exist. It's supposed to create like a market that is transparent in terms of policies and regulations. So things are definitely moving forward in terms of how investors can look at Africa and how they can go in. But like with any other jurisdiction that you want to go into, you don't go in blindly. You try to understand what that market means and the potential that exists. And the best way you can do that is by going in with the advisors, the lawyers, but also with the investors that are already making a lot of headway in those places, which is where, the investing in private equity and venture capital funds makes a lot of sense, because then you're not going in blind or unequipped. You're going in with experts who have already gained traction within that space and can definitely identify the right type of investments to go into.